Hello, I'm Michael Davis, and welcome to Constitutional Day in Nashua, New Hampshire. And this is being sponsored by the New Hampshire Center for Constitutional Studies. Today, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Paul Jehle, and he's going to be doing a talk on the Establishment and Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. Dr. Paul Jehle is a pastor of the New Testament Christian Church in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and founder of the New Testament Christian School. Paul, along with the staff and student body of the New Testament Christian School, has played a key role in helping make the Constitutional Day an annual event for no less than 6 of the last 10 years. The New Hampshire Center of Constitutional Studies is grateful to Dr. Jehle for leading us in his constitutional scholarship and for helping to make Constitutional Day a more meaningful and annual event.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Paul Jehle, and we're going to be dealing with the First Amendment, specifically two clauses in the First Amendment, what is called the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, having to do with religion and religious expression. It'd be safe to say that these two clauses are some of the most misunderstood in the Constitution. However, the further we go on in American history, almost every clause is misunderstood, so it becomes very difficult to say which one is most misunderstood. But really, I want to just say from the beginning a very quick, not a disclaimer, but an explanation. Because I'm not going to have time to go through all of the various aspects of how the Constitution should be interpreted. Keep in mind that I am going to come from an original intent perspective, and we're going to go back to the actual debates that surrounded the establishment of these two clauses so that we can have a better understanding of what they mean and why they're there. Well, let's begin by looking at the following. First of all, the Bill of Rights is a group of 10 amendments, as you may know, that were all ratified together December 15, 1791. They became part officially of the Constitution in December of 1791. Now, several leaders and states threatened to vote against the Constitution in 1787 and 1788 because there was no Bill of Rights. The whole origin of why the First Amendment even exists, as well as 1 through 10, was because of a battle between what were called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And one of the first media smear jobs prior to the Constitution being ratified, because actually the Federalists should have been called Nationalists and the Anti-Federalists should have been called Federalists. And so you have a little misnomer about what the battle was all about. However, there were some very interesting reasons why people opposed the Bill of Rights, and they really crossed over what you might call nothing to do with what we see today as party affiliation. The parties today have become, unfortunately, similar in their espousing of non-constitutional principles. But back here at the time of the founding, all the various divisions and parties espoused constitutional principles. They had variations in how they looked at it. Well, several leaders threatened to vote against it. Washington, in his inaugural address, actually brought up the topic and made it very applicable, broke the ice, so to speak, for the first Congress to begin dealing with this. And of course, he was inaugurated in April of 1789, on April 30. And remember that at least 2 states were still not even in the Union, had not even ratified the Constitution at the time. But Washington said this: besides the ordinary objects submitted to your care, it will remain with your judgment to decide how far an exercise of the occasional power delegated by the 5th article of the Constitution, now the 5th article is about amendments, is rendered expedient to the present juncture by the nature of objections which have been urged against the system. For I assure myself that while you carefully avoid every alteration which might endanger the benefits of a united and effective government, or which ought to await the future lessons of experience, a reverence for the characteristic rights of freemen and a regard for the public harmony will sufficiently influence your deliberation on the question how far the former can be impregnably fortified, or the latter be safely and advantageously promoted. Now, for some today, we have to even read Washington's inaugural address a couple of times to really get the context, but everyone understood who was listening at the time what he meant, and that was this: it's dangerous to think you're going to promote a good government through amendments. Be careful when you amend the Constitution, he was saying, because if you amend the Constitution with actual amendments that disagree with the fundamental principles by which the Constitution was written, you could undermine the very document itself by amendments. Or in other words, amendments could make the Constitution into a somewhat living document because they're on different functioning principles. And he hasn't used the phrase that's so popular today about the living document, the Constitution. So Washington, however, broke the ice. Look, you have objected to this system and you want amendments. He knew they were the Bill of Rights. Everyone else did also. Well, let's look at some of the facts. Washington promised that he would endorse the consideration of amendments. He did so in his inaugural address. James Madison, another one who was at the Constitutional Convention, also promised that he said, when I promised to you, he was in a very tight race to be elected to Congress. He was nearly defeated from Virginia, and he had a very, very notorious battle. And one of the reasons he won his congressional seat was on the promise that he would inaugurate and initiate amendments, like the Bill of Rights, to the Constitution in the first session of Congress. Now, of course, if he was today, people would not believe anybody who promises something in a campaign. Back then, they actually believed it, and guess what? He fulfilled it. He followed through. Well, on June 8th, 1789, which is very soon after the first Congress was actually assembled, he brought up the idea of a Bill of Rights. Interestingly enough, his fellow colleagues in the Congress were not so sure that they wanted a Bill of Rights, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. By the time that it was suggested, 189 amendments were submitted to Congress. 189. These were reduced to 17, and the Congress approved only 12, and the states ratified only 10. So you recognize that this was not like 10 amendments put before the states. There were hundreds of amendments, literally 189, which proved the point of some who didn't want a Bill of Rights in the first place. And let me share with you why. Alexander Hamilton was a proponent of being against the Bill of Rights, and his own reputation and sometimes his philosophy, which tended to bleed a little bit, as it did even during the first presidency. Some were not listening maybe as well as they should have. But listen to what he says. A minute detail of particular rights, this is from Federalist 84 now. A minute detail of particular rights is certainly far less applicable to a constitution like that under consideration, which is merely intended to regulate the general political interests of the nation, than to a constitution which has the regulation of every species of personal and private concerns. Now, think of what he's going to say here. If, therefore, the loud clamors against the plan of the convention on this score are well-founded, no epithet of reproduction will be too strong for the Constitution of the States, reprobation. But the truth is that both of them contain all which, in relation to their objects, it is reasonably to be desired. I go further, and I affirm, Alexander Hamilton speaking now, that the Bill of Rights, in the sense and to the extent in which they are contended for, are not only unnecessary in the proposed Constitution, but would even be dangerous. They would contain various exceptions to powers not granted, and on this very account would afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. For why declare that things shall not be done when there is no power to do them? Why, for instance, should it be said that the liberty of the press shall not be restrained when no power is given by which the restrictions may be imposed? I will not contend that such a provision would confer a regulating power, but it is evident that it would furnish to men disposed to usurp power a plausible pretense for claiming that power. This may serve as a specimen of the numerous handles which would be given to the doctrine of constructive powers by the indulgence of an injudicious zeal for a Bill of Rights. Now, let's condense what he's saying. The Constitution was unique in all constitutions of the world because it was considered an express powers document. An express powers document means the only power the national, now, or literally the federal government, national and federal are somewhat used synonymously. That isn't necessarily accurate. The word federal means a horizontal covenant, which means the actual state governments in America and their relationship to each other is federalism and the unique balance. So to be practical, Madison always referred to the federal government as the national government, the state's government as the federal government. Because you see, that federalism meant all the various governments of the states, to keep clear the distinction between that which is granted to the national government and that which is retained by the states. Now, Alexander Hamilton said, look, the only power we give to the national government is that which is expressly given in the Constitution. So whatever's left out of the Constitution, the national government has no power to deal with it. So if we introduce a Bill of Rights, those amendments will be grounded on the opposite philosophy of the rest of the Constitution. They're going to say the national government cannot do something when we wrote the Constitution deliberately to realize that the only power it had is the power granted to it. Are you with me so far? Okay? Therefore, if you introduce a Bill of Rights, you're going to have the problem of future generations anyway, future generations that will usurp every term that's put in that Bill of Rights will be usurped because the national government will assume they have the power to define those terms. That's a shock. Shouldn't be to us. Now, Hamilton, however, the states countered with this argument. And they said, well, you have to understand, all the states had a Bill of Rights. And the states said, listen, yes, that may be true, but we cannot believe that future generations will fully understand the express powers doctrine document. So you know what we're going to need to do? Let's put a giant stop sign from the states to the national government. No one's going to be able to misunderstand this. Put this stop sign to the national government and tell them the areas they can never interfere with the state government in these areas. Now, you see, this language is so foreign today. Before you talk about any one of the amendments address, starting with the first word, Congress shall make no law. That means the entire system of the Bill of Rights is a stop sign against the Congress. And it means in every area mentioned by the Bill of Rights, the states have total control and the Congress has no control. And don't even get it in your mind. So today, I've been on debates and debates with individuals, and they say to me, well, how can you say that the national government shouldn't have constitutional responsibility for education? Why, the word is not even in the Constitution. And I say, you've just proven my argument, okay? Because it's not in the Constitution, therefore the national government has no power over that. Or whatever else you have. They say, well, how come they didn't write in all the beliefs of religion in the Constitution? For the same reason, so the national government would have no power to define or redefine religion. And that means the states could be as religious as possible. And do you know that every one of the 13 colonies had an established religion at the time of the adoption of the Constitution? This is a shock to people. You actually had to have a religious test. In Massachusetts, where I come from, New Hampshire was similar, and others, you had to raise your right hand and say you believed the Bible was infallible and the blood of Jesus Christ was for the forgiveness of your sin to even hold office. So listen, unless we had some very schizophrenic individuals in Congress, the very individuals who passed the First Amendment were guarding the religion in their states and its relationship to the government. Amazing. True religious liberty, that we continue to call religious liberty, was really not achieved until about the time of the Civil War in America, where even the state governments were not tied to a particular denomination of religion. So the idea of true religious liberty and this idea that the First Amendment ensured religious liberty and the national government was the watchdog to make sure no states were religious is preposterous. You follow me? I mean, it doesn't even, it's laughable to anybody who can read history, and the debates are available for anyone. Well, let's go on. The Bill of Rights was actually a Bill of Wrongs then. Telling the national government what it can't do. The nature of the Constitution then was the opposite. So how are they going to correct this problem between the amendments built on differing principles in the Constitution they wrote in the 9th and 10th Amendment? To make sure that no one would misunderstand the first 8. Because they were so concerned, remember the battle between the two, as they were called Federalists and Anti-Federalists, those battles were the following, that you want to make sure you interpret the Constitution correctly, and that the rest of the Constitution, we don't want to tell no to the government. Otherwise, how long would the Constitution have to be if we had to write down everything the national government couldn't do? It'd be huge. Most socialist constitutions throughout history are a Bill of Rights, basically saying that the national government will not do the following things, meaning it's sovereign to do everything else. And then because it's sovereign, it can redefine what it can't do to mean it can do it in these areas. So the point is, you really have no liberty at all. Our Constitution was very unique in that regard. So the idea here, the 9th and 10th Amendments, if you are not familiar with them, actually the Bill of Rights, in order for it to be passed and ratified by the states, it had to contain a preamble, which has been dropped out of most editions of the Constitution. The preamble is this: The convention of a number of states having at the time of their adopting the Constitution expressed a desire, in order to prevent misconstruction or abuse of its powers, that further declaratory and restrictive clauses be added, and as extending the ground of public confidence in the government will best ensure the beneficent ends of this institution, be it resolved. So the preamble to all the Bill of Rights said, look, the states required this to be even clearer that the national government can't interfere. I wonder why that preamble's no longer around. The nature of every one of the Bill of Rights, then, is a prohibition against Congress. And, of course, the 9th and 10th Amendments, then, are added because they say whatever hasn't been granted to the national government is never to be assumed that the national government has it, remember? But inherent to the states or to the people. So you have the one of the 9th and 10th Amendment, you have the constructive clause, how the Constitution should be interpreted, and then you have the amendment that all the powers not granted are automatically with the people and with the states. The interesting thing about some people come up to me all the time, they just say, well, isn't the answer to this problem an amendment to the Constitution? Everyone wants to solve whatever crisis they're going through with another amendment to the Constitution. Then once we amend the Constitution for a balanced budget, now we amend the Constitution for no flag burning, now we amended the Constitution. And what's to keep the people who are there now can't even read the Constitution? The 9th and 10th Amendment tell them how to interpret it, and judges still don't interpret it that way. And what will adding after there's no power in the Constitution that says that they can spend money on 90% of what they spend money on, and that's already in the Constitution. Now we need an amendment to tell them further what they can't spend. You see what I'm saying? The idea of this amending area that's going to solve our problem is not going to solve the problem. That's not to say there's never a need for amendment, but we need to be careful. All right, with that in mind, let's move right into the issues here, the establishment and the free exercise clauses. We have to go back, if we believe in original intent, we believe in, that's what the phrase being used here by Hamilton, the preamble to the Bill of Rights, it says the constructing nature of the Constitution. That simply means that you interpret it in the way it was constructed. We call that today original intent. And I would tell you that probably an excellent book to get is Original Intent by David Barton. You'll just read court case after court case. You'll read some excellent, I highly recommend that as a background book. Also as a background book, Daniel Dreisbach's Real Threat and Mere Shadow. It's an excellent book as well. Now there's many books I could recommend in the First Amendment. Actually, not just the First Amendment, but these particularly deal with the two clauses we're addressing here. And they go into great detail, uncovering for you and give you lots of quotes from the original Congress and the original context and original intent. So there's some tremendous ideology in that. And there's one further book that we have in our book table I'll talk to you about in just a minute that I think is a shorter book. These are heavy-duty books. You really like to get into some meat. The other one, easy reading, and I think would be helpful to you on that as well. Make it shorter and not feel like you have to dedicate 2 more months to what you were studying. Well, let's look at the states that prohibited the national government from interfering with their own choice. You have to realize that the no religious test clause at the national level, Article 6 of the Constitution, was not because the founders were anti-religion, it's because they were pro-religion and pro-freedom of religion. And they basically felt any state could choose to be as religious as it wanted to be. And you recognize now, we weren't at the place where, at that point, in 1789, we weren't at the place where they could say that they should be as irreligious as they wanted to be. The seeds were there, and eventually that would come. But in 1789, that would be misreading history. The only way that you could really do it in context would be that they didn't care if the colony actually said the Protestant Christian faith is the faith of this colony. Therefore, go live someplace else if you don't like it. That was the context in which they looked at it. But the national government was not going to have a religious test because they didn't want the national government imposing religion on the states. Are you with me? So they wanted to make sure the national government had no power to impose any brand of religion. They felt it was dangerous to go above the state level in establishing any religion or prohibiting its free exercise. Because if the national government did that, they'd be right back where they left from England. And they didn't like that. Now, we know today, reading from hindsight, you could say, yeah, you could be hypocritical. You don't want to be persecuted, and then you persecute everybody else that doesn't go along with your religion at the state level. But the point is, they weren't coming to have a laissez-faire society. They believe very strongly, the founders, and as I'll share with you, they believe very strongly some very fundamental things about government that we'll get to. So let's just look at this, the House debates. Remember, for a bill to be passed, it in this case, since it didn't require money, it didn't have to start in the House of Representatives. But remember, whatever's debated in the House will then go where? If it starts in the House, it's going to go to the Senate. And then if the House and Senate don't disagree, this was the very first Congress, and they had to have a committee with members of both the House and Senate to work out their differences before it would go back to the House and the Senate and be passed before it would go to the President to be signed. You follow me? So it's a little bit, not complicated, but it's definitely going to get worked over. Okay? And basically, from about June, Madison brings up the idea. Nobody bites on it. Nobody really thinks the Bill of Rights is that necessary. They lag. Madison keeps on following his promise. He promised his constituency. That's what got him elected, to keep bringing this up. He kept bringing it up. Now, the debates that I will refer to are from about the first week of August till about the last week of September, first week of October of 1789. Okay? And those, if you look at the original records, you can pull out these statements. Madison said this: Congress should not establish a religion and enforce the legal observation of it by law. You see what he's saying? Can't have that. The states seem to entertain an opinion that under the clause of the Constitution it enabled them, Congress, to make laws of such a nature as might establish a national religion. To prevent these effects, the amendment was intended. Mr. Madison thought if the word national was inserted before religion, it would satisfy the minds of honorable gentlemen. He thought if the word national was introduced, it would point the amendment directly to the object in which it was intended. Notice, Madison said this. What we really should say is the national government should never establish a national religion, and then everyone should be satisfied, because we're not going to say that the national government should prohibit religion. In fact, they said here, there's one congressman stood up on the floor and said, what if someone in the future, because we mention religion, thinks the national government's job is to prohibit religion? What if someone would ever think of that? And they often, it's amazing, because when you read from the lens of today, back in the debates, I'm waiting for the next congressman. Come on, somebody. And they go, oh. You know, some had foresight, but they were like 2 or 3 of them, because they couldn't conceive of the society we have today. It was very, very difficult. And we probably can't quite conceive the freedom of then. But still, looking at this, you can see what Madison's point is. Others said, like Peter Sylvester of New York, he had doubts. He feared that the First Amendment might be thought to have a tendency to abolish religion altogether. Nobody said anything after he said that. Mr. Jeyle of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, said it would read better if it was that no religious doctrine shall be established by law. Notice what they're saying. Let's be very clear what we're dealing with here. George Mason said, all men have an equal, natural, unalienable right to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience. No particular sect or society of Christians ought to be favored or established by law in preference to others. Now notice, they're talking about congressional law. You follow me? They're not talking about their states here. They're talking about the national government. Fisher Ames of Massachusetts, who actually was the one who came up with the initial wording of the First Amendment. He's known as the author of the First Amendment. Fisher Ames said, Congress shall make no law establishing religion or to prevent the free exercise thereof or to infringe the rights of conscience. Of course, that phrase has since been dropped. So you have this idea that the national government cannot in any way restrict the religion of the states and can in no way stop the free exercise of the religion of the state or the relationship of the religion to the state government. National government, stay away when it comes to religion. Now let's go to the Senate debates. The Senate debates, the first proposal was this: Congress shall make no law establishing one religious sect or society in preference to others or to infringe on the rights of conscience. Very similar to the House. In other words, this is not rocket science to find out the original intent. This is not, let's go through and find a needle in a haystack here. You just read the debates. And it's clear that the idea of the First Amendment was to keep the national government from actually establishing a religion within the states, favoring a religion within the states. Because remember, Article 1, Section 8, said that one of the things you can spend money on in Congress is the general welfare. That meant it has to benefit everyone equally in proportion. So if you favored a religion that only 5 states practice, you violate the General Welfare Clause. You follow me? Or if you give money at the national level to anything that would favor a class of people, a certain problem that is not pervasive in the nation, it violates the general welfare. They called it special welfare was outlawed. General welfare was lawful. I wonder how many bills would be defeated today that violate the general welfare clause. Hundreds of them. Because it doesn't affect everyone. Generally, it affects specific people. Now, of course, once you do give money to one cause, guess what? How many people are going to lobby for part of the pocketbook expense? So now the Senate's not even thinking of that because of this. Members of the Senate wanted to amend to deal with religion so that it would be impossible to misconstrue the intent to keep the national government out. Another proposal was Congress shall make no law establishing any particular denomination. There's the Senate now, in preference to another, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, nor shall the rights of conscience be infringed. You see, the founders believed that your right of conscience was not your right to do anything you want. They believed that your right of conscience came from God. God's the one that gave you the conscience. And you can't read into the Constitution without reading the understanding of the people at the time. Because predominantly it was a Christian civilization in the sense of majority of the individuals Christian. Not all of them, but a majority. They thought, since God is the one that gave the conscience, God is the one that gave that freedom, they were not looking at atheism or irreligion. In fact, most individuals recognize to read in, as many people do, that the United States Constitution was designed as an atheistic document, that it was to totally separate religion from government, is a tremendous misreading because the context isn't there. They often thought the rights of conscience was synonymous. Do you realize that in the Senate they desired to eliminate the phrase rights of conscience because they said it was redundant? Interesting. That the right of conscience was redundant with the practice of religion. So it was not looked at as the right of conscience of irreligion or of anything that would supplant the government and the law. Do you know, they went even so far as to say, we have nothing against Catholics, but we do have something against the Catholic governmental system, which is centralized and top-down, and if that gets into the basis of our laws, it will turn our republic on its head. So you're free to practice your religion, but not to introduce the government. That's historic at the time. It's not anti-Catholic. I don't mean that in any way anti-Catholic. But the idea is you have to realize that you have this mentality in their hearts and minds. And if you don't know that, you misread. You misread the context of what's going on. But let's go on. Now they have the committee. What are we going to do? How are we going to resolve the difference between the House version and the Senate version? Because they were different in their wording. So the free exercise clause, the rights of conscience, was dropped due to its redundancy. Also, in the House debates, they wanted to secure the rights of conscience, and the free exercise of religion did that automatically. We don't want to patronize those who profess no religion at all. Someone stood up and said, no, wait a minute, we're not giving rights and favoritism. We're not giving privileges here to people. If someone wants to be irreligious, that's their duty, that's their right. They can do it. They're not going to be persecuted for it. But at the same time, realize our nation was not founded on irreligion. And it's actually the practice of Christianity that gives protection to those who don't practice Christianity. See, that's the idea, because we have to look at what the religion produces in the society. So it's an interesting study to take any religion you'd like on the whole world, including what is supposedly non-religion. I don't think atheism is non-religion. I think it's a strong belief. But anyway, the only absolute that they believe is that there are no absolutes. But the point is, if you take any religious system, that religious system will produce a government and a certain kind of society. And the seed and the fruit. And the very interesting thing is, many people like the fruit of what Christianity produces, but they don't want to honor the root of where it came from, whether or not they're professing Christian or not. Now, let's move on, though. So what happened here? Well, the clergy got into the act here, talking to their representatives, because they wanted to make sure. Now, you make sure that the national government stays out of the religion of the states because of this. Now, this is good foresight. The clergy said, we don't ever want to be questioned what we preach from the pulpit. Because we can preach on any topic we wish. If a lobbyist can speak in Congress, and if a congressman can be free from arrest for saying anything on the House floor, going to or from to protect his liberty of speech, then indeed the clergy ought to have at least as much freedom of speech. So let's also make sure that we mean don't you interfere with the pulpit. That's what people believe today. Well, we recognize this, the idea of establishment clause, adding the word respecting in order to keep federal laws from either establishing or disestablishing religion. Do you see the idea of that final wording of the First Amendment said that you respect that? It meant this, that the national government could not only can't stop the free exercise of religion or the establishment, but it can't stop even the disestablishment of a state from religion if they wish to, and it can't force them to disestablish. Do you follow me? See how jealous the states were of their rights, down to the key wording. You know, every word of the First Amendment was debated. Do we use a? Do we use and? In fact, here's another one. They keep that. They cannot force religion on the states, but neither can they interfere with religion already practiced within any state. You follow me? Don't meddle with it. They use the modifier an, rather than the, so that it could not be misunderstood to prohibit religious expression over non-religious expression. In other words, only official acts favoring one religious denomination over another was prohibited. The amendment does not prohibit religion itself. See, they actually took the modifiers in English that would make sure that the national government could never prohibit religion. It could only prohibit the national government from favoring one religious denomination over the other. You follow me? So we're talking about a giant stop sign to the national government, which now is so small no one can see it. Now we recognize this. The clergy desired no national church. They did not want a state church or a church state. In fact, Philip Schaff, the great church historian, said this in the late 1800s. What is the distinct character of American Christianity in its organized social aspect and its relation to the national life as compared with the Christianity of Europe? He's saying this: it is a free church and a free state, or a self-supporting and self-governing Christianity in independent but friendly relation to the civil government. Civil liberty requires for its support religious liberty. Cannot prosper without it. Religious liberty is not an empty sound, but an orderly exercise of religious duties, an enjoyment of all its privileges. It is freedom in religion, never freedom from religion. As the true civil liberty in America is freedom in law, but never freedom from law. You see, this was well understood at the time. To recognize this, that's why the Ninth Amendment, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, shall not be construed to deny others retained by the people, and the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states and to the people. This was clear. Well, if we would boil this down, take all the debates, take it in context, read it through, for those first two clauses, we'd have to conclude some of the following. The vast majority of the founders did not mean they were personally Christian. Did not mean all of them were evangelical Christians like we might say today. But they believed this. They believed that Christianity was the best source for the best kind of law system that would produce the best protection for even those who disagree with it. Here was the question. What religion will protect the rights of people who disagree with that religion? And they literally went through the world, and some of the times you can look at it. Will certain religious system, does that religious system persecute those who disagree with it, or even protect their rights to vocalize their disagreement to it? And their belief was that Christianity produced the best tree with the most shade for even the people who don't like the root of the tree. Do you follow me? And that did not mean that every founder who said that was a Christian. Okay? They just believed in a survey that Christianity was the best one to be the root of the law. Second thing that we could boil it down to, they believed that Christianity by its very nature should never be forced on people. You should not be forced to become a Christian. Benjamin Franklin said one time, "Let the truth and error stand next to each other freely. Even a fool can tell the difference." But when the government refuses the truth to be set next to the error and starts to decide which is true, then the government has already decided for the people what is right and what is wrong, and will only deliver them the plate they want him to eat. That's a paraphrase from some of Franklin's stuff. And well wise. Now, you may know of the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty in 1786. Very powerful statement. Read just a couple of excerpts. "Well aware that Almighty God hath created the mind free, and that all attempts to influence it by punishment or burden, by civil incapacitation, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness." What do you think? See, Christianity, by its very nature, if the civil government externally punishes you for not being a Christian, it actually works against the very thing you say you want. In other words, then all they're going to do is act Christian by hypocrisy. So it's got to be a voluntary matter of the heart between a man and God. Religion cannot be forced by the civil government. It cannot be attached. And therefore, Virginia was one of the first states to work for true religious liberty, even at the state level, and yet recognize Christianity as the base of the law system that would produce the greatest, and I used the just illustration of a tree, shade to even those who disagree with it. And you realize that. And of course, there's much more in that Virginia statute for religious freedom, but time is impelling me to move on. Do note this, though. The founders did recognize, though it would take time to work out, there was a great distinction between what was called religious liberty and religious toleration. You see, in Europe, religious toleration was well understood. And that was simply this, that when the national government can marry to a certain religion, they may tolerate other religions, but you don't really have a right to believe any differently. It's given at government privilege. In other words, it's government grant. If it's a toleration, it's government granted. If it is liberty, it is God-given. You see? Philip Schaff, for instance, this historian again, makes a very good point when he says this. There's a very great difference between toleration and liberty. Toleration is a concession, which may be withdrawn. It implies a preference for the ruling form of faith and worship, a practical disapproval of all other forms. It may be coupled with many restrictions and disabilities. We tolerate what we dislike but cannot alter. We tolerate even a nuisance if we must. In our country, we ask no toleration for religion and its free exercise, but we claim it as an inalienable right. Freedom of religion is one of the greatest gifts of God to man, without distinction of race or color. He is the author and Lord of the conscience, and no power on earth has a right to stand between God and conscience. You see, this was the ultimate fruit that would take place in America. Not in religion, not the fact that they had to have a respect on what basis of law. Because here's the point. If you have various conflicting philosophies that are at the base of what laws you consider legitimate, aren't you going to have a schizophrenic society? You have various philosophies. Today, we say what we protect is philosophical pluralism. So that anybody can believe anything, and we believe that no law is essentially right or wrong philosophically. We just have laws as expedient measures to get things done. So what's the result of that? A federal register that you couldn't even read in a lifetime. There are so many laws, you'd never be able to read them all till the time you die, so you don't even know how many you're disobeying. We're probably disobeying federal laws right now without even knowing it. Because not even everybody, you have to hire people, usually paid for by the government, in order to discern what the government law means. And that's very dangerous. And so, now it's interesting that, for instance, Louis de Boer in his book, Lord of the Conscience, I highly recommend this as a great book. Not only does he come from a good theological point of view, but a very strong point of view that the religious liberty actually originates from the two tables of the law. That the left table of the law, the left table meaning the one that you'd normally look, the first 4 commandments dealt with a man and his God. Second 6 commandments dealt with your relation to neighbor. And the two tables of the law from the beginning were religious liberty and civil liberty. And actually, the working out of religious liberty was critical. And it's critical to understand his point toward his conclusion. In fact, de Boer says this toward the end. The Constitution, the First Amendment notwithstanding, did not establish religious liberty in the United States of America. Now, you have to realize this. The First Amendment did not establish religious liberty for all individuals. It established religious liberty for who? The states. Do you follow me? Because if you lived in Massachusetts, you were living in a Protestant state. It was clearly articulated. That's the way it was. In Maryland, it was a Catholic state. And it was clear. In various states, you had various versions of Christianity. But now, let me have de Boer go on. This is not generally recognized today, and there is a pervasive myth that Americans have always had a constitutional right to full religious liberty. Again, what is important to recognize is that religious liberty, or the lack thereof, was left up to each state to work out for itself, simply without any federal oversight or interference. You follow? In other words, leave them alone. Eventually, the states did disestablish their state church and adopted a position of religious liberty. Now, not every state had a state church like England. Now, in Massachusetts, the original Massachusetts Constitution allowed for taxpayer money to support Protestant preachers because they said in order to keep Christianity as a foundation of the law, if your town doesn't have a Protestant preacher, let the assembly vote in tax money to pay him until you can pay him yourself. Now, then John Adams, when he wrote the Constitution, did not expect the government to be paying him very long. Just pay him until you can pay him. Once you can pay him, we'll withdraw the money. But they believed it so strongly, they believed in tax support for the right religion at the state level. But that's not the national level. Do you follow the difference? Okay? Just so you don't misunderstand the context at the time period. Back to Deborah again. Okay? Eventually, the states all did disestablish their state churches. But it is important to note that this took place after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. It took place voluntarily, not as a result of the Constitution or federal mandates, and that it took place before the 14th Amendment ever came into existence. And this is where we need to then make a right turn, or maybe a left turn, whichever way we want to word it, to see what's happened since. Well, you might say, well, gee, are you really misunderstanding the context here? Well, September 25, 1789, the day before the First Amendment was discussed in Congress, the Congress asked President Washington to proclaim a day of thanksgiving, which he eventually did November 26, 1789, and thank God. So the very congressmen who wrote the First Amendment were not against God. And so you realize that this context again is affirmed. Well, what about the modern era idea of separation of church and state, that which we hear as if it's some established doctrine? Where do we get it? Well, you might know this, but I'll just quickly take you through the history of it. The origin of the phrase separation of church and state comes, the Danbury Baptists wrote to Thomas Jefferson when he was president. They were very happy Jefferson was elected. They were of the, quote, anti-federalist branch, as Jefferson was, even though that wasn't an official party till later. And this is what they said to him. They were so happy Jefferson was elected. They said, among the many millions in America and Europe who rejoice in your election to office, we embrace the first opportunity to express our great satisfaction in your appointment to the Chief Magistrate of the United States. We have reason to believe that America's God has raised you up to fill the chair of state out of that goodwill which he bears to the millions of you over which you preside. May God strengthen you for the arduous task which Providence and the voice of the people have called you. And may the Lord preserve you safe from every evil and bring you at last to his heavenly kingdom through Jesus Christ, our glorious mediator. Now here's the Danbury Baptist Convention writing to the President of the United States. Of course, amazingly, the President writes back. But we have to say this, but they add this clause in their letter. Our sentiments are uniformly on the side of religious liberty. That religion is at all times a place between God and the individual, that no man ought to suffer in name, person, or effects on account of his religious opinions, and that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish he who works ill to his neighbor. But, sir, our constitution of government is not specific. Therefore, what religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as an inalienable right. See what they're saying? Look, it appears even with the First Amendment, sir, that we have government-granted rights of religion, not inalienable. And this is his reply, January 1, 1802. Just a few months later, Jefferson writes back. This is Jefferson writing. I think it's kind of funny. It's Jefferson, the one who's picked on it for being an atheist. No, he wouldn't have been an evangelical Christian. He certainly wouldn't have been an atheist. But he writes back, he says this, Gentlemen, the affectionate sentiments of esteem and approbation which you have said to me are so good as to express towards me on behalf of the Danbury Baptist Association give me the highest satisfaction. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. Remember, Jefferson was part of the Statute of Religious Liberty in 1786. He says this, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. There's the famous phrase taken out of context eternally, it appears. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation on behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tend to you for yourselves and your religious association assurances of my highest respect and esteem. Or in other words, the phrase separation of church and state meant the Congress cannot regulate religion or the church. That's what it meant. He used that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, meaning he was substituting the phrase religion for church and state for national government. State is often, the word state does not often mean literally your state, does it? State can mean civil government. So you have Jefferson here saying government is limited to dealing with behavior, social duties which flow from natural rights, God-given, the laws of nature and nature's God. So Jefferson is basically saying, look, your rights are secure, Danbury Baptist. The national government, just because religion is not mentioned positively, that's for your benefit. The fact that the First Amendment, let me clarify, the First Amendment has built a wall between the national government's right to regulate religion and your state. Or if you want to look at it, the wall is so thick that the legislature and Congress can't penetrate that to your religion within your state. That's, of course, how it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court ever since. Well, no. And where did that come from? The 14th Amendment. Now, it's interesting. In Barrow v. Baltimore, 1833, Chief Justice John Marshall declared this, quote, "The Constitution was ordained and established by the people of the United States for themselves and for their own government, not for the government of the individual states. Therefore, the Bill of Rights contains no expression indicating an intention to apply them to the state governments." John Marshall wrote in 1833 in a decision that the Bill of Rights can never be used by the national government against the states, because they were written by the states against what? The national government. 1878, Reynolds versus United States. Jefferson's letter was actually referenced. First time. Coming as this does from an acknowledged leader of the advocates of the measure, Jefferson's letter, may be accepted almost as an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of the amendment. Congress is deprived of all legislative power over all religious opinion, but was left only free to reach actions that violate the social duties of humanity. So in other words, if you harm somebody else in the name of your religion, you are not protected. You follow me? If your actions, if you say, well, my religion teaches murder, and I'm going to go murder in the name of my God, sorry, you're not protected by the national government. You're going to be prosecuted. Do you follow me? But they can't prosecute you for your opinion. But they can prosecute you for your actions. Follow me? That's 1878. Well, the 14th Amendment predates that by about 10 years. What was so bad about this? 14th Amendment had a trend to remove state citizenship under the issue of slavery and remove it to the national citizenship, so you were a citizen of the nation before you were a citizen of the state. That violates Article 4 of the state. That was a terrible trend, because it was such a vengeful amendment written against the South that it was not as clear as it could have been. Most attorneys will agree that's the most jumbled, confusing amendment there is in the Constitution. Dangers. It was written in vengeance, another danger. However, the original intent of that 14th Amendment was never to be misreading the Bill of Rights. Nothing in that amendment said the Bill of Rights were to be used against the states by the national government, but it's been quoted as the engine to do so ever since. Since 1940, the Supreme Court has consistently misinterpreted the 14th Amendment, automatically read into the Constitution that the Bill of Rights should be used against the states in order to protract civil liberties. As a result of this switch in power from the local to the national, we've lost religious liberty at the state level and civil liberty with it. Because once you say that we have to make sure that a state does not deal with some way properly with religion, automatically what you're going to end up doing then is you're going to lose some civil liberty. Because once the national government can penetrate the state governments and ignore the constitutional the ramifications of that and the parameters of the Constitution, once they can do that, they won't stop at religion, will they? It'll stop and the whole 14th Amendment now has been turned on its head. Now, some of it is the fault of the 14th Amendment itself. Others, the original intent has been reread, misread, and revised. So what do we do about this? Obviously, now today, the national government on a regular basis causes state governments to remove crosses, to remove creches, manger scenes, to remove all those kinds of things in the name of the separation of church and state, having no bearing on the original intent. Well, one of the first things we need to do, there's two-prong effect here, and it takes time. We need to have the Congress of the United States regulate the courts. That's already in the Constitution. The courts and how they deal with their appellate reception of cases, the Supreme Court has only the power in the case brought before it. When the Supreme Court renders a decision, it is not law for all 50 states. It is only law in that case. And it says, under the regulations that Congress shall make. Well, Congress needs to make a few. And I say a lot of our problem in America today is a passive Congress that won't do what it's supposed to do and meddles in areas it's not supposed to be involved in. That's why we have a blank check given to the president in so many areas that's not given in the Constitution. A lot of that fault comes to the Congress. They can take the check away any time they wish. And therefore, we have a problem at the congressional level. We also have a problem, obviously, at the state level. It would take some states to interpose between themselves and the national government. I think it'd only take one or two. Can you imagine one or two states basically saying, excuse me, we've read the Bill of Rights and we read the original intent. And you are interfering here. So goodbye ACLU, goodbye whoever it is you are hiring, and stay out of our state. We'll be as religious or as irreligious as we desire to be. And if one or two states stood up to the national government, it would inspire many more. And therefore, we need to look at that and remember the original context of what took place. That originally, to understand American liberty, Christianity was looked at and respected as the source of the law. That didn't mean you were forced to be a Christian by any means. At the same time, we recognized that fruit protected people and their rights, even to disagree with whatever religion formed the base of that law. I close with this. I was in a debate, a live debate, national radio, with an atheist who was basically trying to tell me that I had misread the Constitution and that this was actually an atheistic country. When we got down to the break toward the end, I simply said to him, what I don't understand, sir, is why don't you live in the nation that has codified your religion into law? It was big silence. I said, after all, if your religion is so wonderful, why don't you live in the culture and the context of the law that came from your religion? And of course, I named a couple of nations that were prevalent at the time. I said, should I answer the question for you since there's silence on the other end here? And after the guy who was running the debate to the commercial came back, I said, maybe it's because you don't have as much freedom to even debate me on the radio in your nation that codified your religion into law. Then I would suggest you have more honor for the religion that gave you the freedom to debate me on radio. And that, my friend, is the religion of Christianity. Because it has given you the freedom to disagree openly and publicly, and may the best case be won voluntarily on the hearts of the listeners. That is the meaning of the First Amendment. God bless you.